Alan Moore introduced us all to John Constantine about a year into his run writing Swamp Thing. I was being facetious in the Hellboy review. Constantine was more than just an exposition delivery system. Moore's usual overwriting took care of exposition perfectly well, leaving John to be both the wise-ass sage who guides the hero through a quest of self-discovery, and a keyhole through which some of us glimpsed a side of mainstream comic books that we'd rarely, if ever, seen before. Literal armies of heroes stand ready to defend the physical sides of the multiverse. The metaphysical and spiritual sides are much more sparsely guarded, mostly by beings that only have a distant memory of or tangential connection to humanity. Constantine has the opposite problem. He is, in every sense of the phrase, all too human. A writhing snake pit of vices and bad conscience, barely constrained by a lifetime's worth of regret. And the occasional flight of altruism that he usually has to be dragged into, kicking and screaming. In 1993, DC Comics editor Karen Berger folded Constantine, Swamp Thing, Morpheus, the King of Dreams, Lucifer the Morning Star, and a bunch of other characters whose titles I couldn't afford to buy at the time, under the banner of Vertigo Comics. All Vertigo titles were suggested for mature readers, meaning they've aged better than a lot of comics that passed through industry censors. And their success did a lot to eventually destroy the industrial censorship regime that had ruled over American comics since the moral panics of the 1950s. It's hard to remember now that every bookstore has a manga section and Lucifer is a TV series. But the United States of America is a country of pinch-faced Calvinist psychopaths who cannot bear the thought of their precious children reading any story about heaven and hell that was written less than 1800 years ago. Before 9/11, this was one of the major issues capturing my nation's attention. Yes, we really were that dumb. Some of us still are. I mean, why do you think Donald Trump's president? So it's no wonder Warner Brothers tried and failed to make a Constantine movie several times throughout the 90s. And it should come as no surprise that they only, finally, succeeded by playing it, quote-unquote, safe. Or what they thought was safe. They attached a name actor to the project, fresh off his own blockbuster trilogy. They shot for a PG-13 and wound up with an R anyway, for reasons that are buried in the MPAA's industrial censorship regime. They still failed, according to the only metrics that matter to them, which is, of course, money. But that failure almost looks preordained in retrospect. After all, they took Constantine out of the DC universe, with its ever-expanding, pantheistic, and weird, in a Weird Tales magazine sense of the phrase, metaphysics. Instead, they plopped old Johnny Boy down into a universe that's at least superficially Catholic, like so many Hollywood horror movies. I suspect that's because of The Exorcist. Yes, LA's a big old Catholic town, still today. Largest archdiocese in the US, for whatever that's worth. But its hometown industry is run by suits who can only think of things in the most superficial terms. Oh, our protagonist is an exorcist, is he? Well, that's easy. We know how to make that movie. Made one just the previous year. Then we had another slated for May of 2005. In fact, why don't we just move this silly little comic book movie to the post-Valentine's Day doldrums of late February, just to make sure we're not competing with ourselves. Yeah, that way neither of them will make enough money. Well, if you can't make all the money, then why bother trying to make any? Spoken like the video game publisher you wish you were. Oh shit, that's why the WB bought Mortal Kombat. Fuck! And while this movie's plot revolves around the very Catholic obsession with suicide being a mortal sin, its depiction of demonic and angelic agents walking among us and fucking with our lives, as part of some long cold war between heaven and hell, is pure, mainline American Protestantism. as is the repeated theme that God has a plan for us all. There's not much Jesus in this movie, only a few drops of him, in fact, and no Mother Mary outside of some iconography. They're motifs, while Satan and his son Mammon are characters. Millions of my fellow Americans actually believe this, that their every negative thought or bad impulse is the work of a literal demon, while every good thought or positive impulse is a gift to them from their personal guardian angels. And it's supposed to be okay because God has a plan for us all, so don't sweat the small stuff. Like the fact that personal agency or free will are complete illusions in this scheme. I guess that's what they mean when they say it's all small stuff. But since these same millions of people also believe that Hollywood movies are of the devil, none of them showed up for this one. Neither did comic book fans. And personally, I can't really blame us. Back in 2005, we were either saving our pennies for what we still thought of as the Batman prequel, or we were recovering from the trauma of what began life as a Batman sequel, 2004's Catwoman. A movie from the same company that made all the same compromises to escape development hell. Name, lead actor, totally new continuity, might as well be set in a different universe, with results that were extremely painful. So much so that some still call it Catwoman in name only, because denial is more than one of the mother rivers that birthed human civilization. It's everywhere, and its effects are as corrosive as battery acid. It always fascinates me how we nerds can build vast catalogs of alternate universes and revel in their minor differences. Oh, that's the one where everybody's a vampire. Oh, that's the one where everyone's gender flipped and Magneto is a total babe. Oh, that's the one where Superman's rocket landed in Soviet Ukraine instead of Kansas. But then we turn around and label every version of a thing that we don't like the thing we don't like in name only. You don't see me running around calling Smallville Superman in name only. I don't even let myself get off that easy. To my mind, there's an obvious way to square this circle, especially since we're obviously in a universe very different from the mainline comics. So that bloke over there is Constantine. You know, like the thing at the end of your fork. Yeah. Well, this motherfucker over here is Constantine. Like the audience demographic this movie was obviously pitched to. Why do you think Chaz is played here by future Hollywood superstar Shia LaBeouf? Barely 1 year before he would be sucked into the maw of Bayhem. Constantine looks like young Sting. Or at least he was originally supposed to. Constantine is very much Keanu Reeves, muttering his way through this role without even attempting an English accent, earning the eternal gratitude of those of us who saw Kenneth Branagh's Much Ado About Nothing and Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula. It's not just him muttering either. Turn the subtitles on or you'll miss half the dialogue in this thing. There's an American football team's worth of people in these credits with some version of sound editor next to their name, and one or more of them fumbled the ball at a 4th and goal with 10 seconds left on the clock. The only way this happens is if a company just does not give a fuck about your project. In which case you should probably get out. I seem to remember it sounding better in a theater-grade sound system, but honestly, how many of us can afford that? Fewer than could in 2005, that's for sure. Subscribe to my Patreon, and you'll get your name attached to this. Really gotta work on my sales pitch. At the same time, that being 2005, none of us expected a comic book movie to even try what this one accomplishes. Constantine, whatever its faults, builds an entire cosmology from scratch in under 2 hours, and it makes at least some amount of sense. As much as normal Christian eschatology makes, at least. The closest we'd had at that point were the Blade films, and even they had trouble deciding whether their vampires were the supernaturally animate undead, or sci-fi viruses with legs and occasionally personalities. By draping itself in the familiar trappings of Exorcist rip-offs, Constantine can come down on the side of the supernatural with a bare minimum of exposition. Oh sure, John explains some big things to his co-protagonist, who is also our audience surrogate, but there's no need to bog everything down by explaining all the little things to her or to us. We don't really know why peering into a cat's eyes for long enough will let you visit hell, or why getting a short, sharp shock while sitting in the electric chair from Sing Sing will let you see through time and space. We don't need to know. And the fact this movie knows we don't need to know immediately puts it head and shoulders above all the Exorcist rip-offs and sequels that are correctly lost to time. I mean, 2's okay, I guess, and 3's got some interesting bits in it, but after that, brothers, sisters, and others, you are fucked. All we really need to know is that the supernatural is real and hiding all around us in plain sight, perched on top of us from every corporate tower and behind every douchebag in a pinstripe suit. Some are born with the gift/curse to see through the fog of heaven and hell's war. Either they repress this knowledge, go insane, or dedicate themselves to fighting the good fight. Begging the question, what even is the good fight, when the good side of this fight seems obsessed with rules and regulations that the bad side seems to summarily ignore all the time, without the slightest consequence? Not at all like real life, no. Not one bit. Speaking of the real world, this is the second best movie version of Heaven and Hell I've seen outside of 1998's What Dreams May Come. It takes the opposite route in depicting them from that Robin Williams movie. Instead of looking like a watercolor come to life, Heaven looks like LA on an impossibly nice day, full of the big, puffy cotton ball clouds you get out here in the West, usually when you're away from the smog and cell phone radiation generators of the cities. Instead of looking like a Bosch painting come to life, hell looks like LA caught at the flashpoint of a nuclear explosion, eternally waiting for a pressure wave that will never ever come to grant the sweet release of obliteration. Except underground. Underground hell actually does look like the right-hand side of Garden of Earthly Delights. But to an artistic depictions of hell nerd like me, believe me, that's grade A certified fan service. Mwah. Speaking of fan service, that's the other thing that immediately endears me to Keanu's performance here. He may not be British, but he is an enormous, unrepentant asshole to everyone he doesn't know or respect. And even to some of the people he does know and respect, though there it may or may not be a bid to keep them at minimum safe distance, since his associates have a dangerous habit of dying unnatural deaths. That ambient assholery is arguably more important to Constantine's character than his nationality or his hair color. It's the difference between a Catwoman who steals shit because she grew up on the hardcore streets of Gotham City and honestly, fuck being poor, and a Catwoman who steals shit because, cats like pretty things? What? Since when is that a stereotype? Like, cats like fish, and sleeping in weird places and positions, and basketball? Wait, what? No! Not remaking my old shit. Looking forward. Into the future. Yeah. The future that totally exists. As is his arc in this film, about learning the value of selflessness through the sacrifice of those few actual friends, and through the experience of helping a person who's basically just like him. And when that experience inadvertently helps the forces of evil bring about a near apocalypse, it is Constantine who tricks the devil himself into stopping it, which is the most Constantine thing of all. Anybody can beat the devil with a giant explosion. Looking at you, Arnold. It's quite something else to beat the devil by fucking with his own vanity. Thus he earns the one thing he spent his entire life trying to get: redemption in the eyes of a judgmental God. Speaking of redemption, you know who doesn't get enough good notices? Rachel Weisz, in her dual role as Angela Dodson, LAPD, and her own twin sister, Isabel. We nerds are so busy litigating Keanu's presence that most of us overlook the actual heart of this film. The actor whose roles allow her to actually emote. Like John, Angela was born with psychic powers. Unlike John, Angela began to repress and deny hers once she saw them buy her sister a scenic tour of California's finer mental health care institutions. Years of maintaining a code of silence and lying to the faces of her loved ones served Angela well in the LAPD, until Isabel commits suicide at the start of this film. Except Isabel would never commit suicide. Unlike so many of us, she was actually devout. Must have been brainwashed into it by some kind of cult. And the LAPD does just happen to know a local paranormal detective. Angela's right. It's just that instead of consisting of humans, the cult is Mammon, the son of Satan, and Gabriel, the strength of God. Gabriel doesn't actually blow a trumpet to announce the end times, but she does blast John across a room to keep him from interfering, so the movie gets metaphor points from me. Gabriel, played by the absolutely angelic Tilda Swinton, plans to kickstart the apocalypse now, out of resentment for humanity's special place in the universe. She plans to make us worthy of God's love, because, as she says to John, it's only in the face of horror that you find your noblest selves. And you can be so noble. She's not wrong. It's just that, as Constantine mentions in an earlier scene between the two, she spent way too much time watching us without ever really trying to understand us. She's observed the world instead of experiencing it, always holding herself separate from it, thanks to that good old-fashioned angelic sense of superiority. And the grinding, everyday horror of Gabriel's observations have led her to believe that the tribulation would actually be a good thing. So, while John and Isabel's suicides were mortal sins, despite their intention to end the cruel and unusual horror of their own lives, Gabriel plans to suicide the world, and has convinced herself it's for our own good. This is the hypocritical bullshit John calls heaven out for, par excellence. But Gabriel gets a line at the end to let us know that even she comes by it honestly. As she stands before a resurrected Constantine, and in Angela she almost turned into a hell portal, she says, "You could have shot me, John, but you chose a higher path. Look how well you're doing." Yeah, and all it took was an almost apocalypse. Thank God the denizens of hell exist outside the laws of time and space, or we'd be truly fucked. But just like in real life, the repeated line about God having a plan for us all severely blunts John's criticism and brings up more questions than it answers. If God truly does have a plan, then all this horror was a part of it, and we're right back to the old theodicy problem. We're faced with a God that intentionally allowed John to kill himself, go to hell for 2 minutes, but thanks to time dilation, 2 minutes in hell is quite enough, thank you, get revived, and meet the sister of another psychic power-inspired suicide years later. God then allowed an archangel to conspire with the enemy and almost bring about the apocalypse, just to teach John Constantine a lesson. And if this God had access to the universes that I do, he'd know that's playing games with luck. Making the God of this universe either the all-seeing, all-knowing, all-loving dude who always wins that his followers think he is. Seriously, when y'all get together, y'all are worse than the worst Superman fan. Or the kid with an ant farm that John calls him in this film, who just so happens to get real lucky that Satan is too vain and short-sighted to let the world end in any way that he did not personally engineer. Shout out to Peter Stormare for playing what's probably my second or third favorite Satan in cinema. Fact remains, he leaves a massive impression with a minimal amount of screen time. If Constantine is an asshole, and he most certainly is, then Satan is a great big slimy dick. Literally, he leaves a trail of what looks like burning pitch wherever he goes. An obvious contrast with his drug dealer's white leisure suit. All Satan wants to be is El Chapo. And an obvious technicality, designed to skirt the so-called rule of this universe, that true citizens of hell aren't allowed to walk the earth. It's like that kid from elementary school. Does this bug you? Ooh, does this bug you? I'm not touching the earth. Does this bug you? I call this rule so-called because, of course, the intrusion of demons into our plane of existence is the inciting incident of this film, letting Constantine know shit's really fucked up, yo. Of course, if God really does have a plan for us all, then he allowed those incursions to happen, specifically so John Constantine wouldn't just immediately tell the psychic cop who wandered into his apartment to fuck off, which he almost does. Until he notices a cloud of demons circling his apartment building. But the real truth is, the only gods of this universe are the filmmakers. And this isn't exactly, say, Dogma. An actually Catholic film written and directed by a single person with an actual viewpoint about the place of the divine in modern American life. Not a very well thought out viewpoint, but still, this is a patchwork quilt of Constantine stories, most of them grafted onto the Dangerous Habits arc. Made by people who were trying their best to work within a system as hypocritical and bullshit-laden as the metaphysical one they depict. There's another repeated line in this. It's not like it is in the books. And since the movie repeats it 3 times, I kind of want to read that as a statement of intent. A sop to we comic book fans who are probably yelling something at the screen like, "Hell is supposed to be a triumvirate, you dumb fucks." See, intent is the hardest thing to prove, especially when you're trying to read the entrails of early 21st century Warner Brothers. The line about how it's not like it is in the books is most often spoken to young Chaz, the teenage sidekick who disappears from the whole middle of the film since his role's absorbed by Angela, and who ignominiously dies at the end in a desperate attempt to exorcise Mammon from Angela's body. It's the old Exorcist formula again. An old priest and a young priest. Except this time, instead of throwing himself out a window, the young priest gets body slammed by Tilda Swinton. I know which way to go out that I'd prefer. But, and it should be obvious by now, I've got a soft spot for this movie. Back in 2005, I might have called it the exception that proves the rule about comic book movie adaptations making changes to their source material. But 10 years of Marvel movies have taught me many things, including the fact that there are no rules, except for the ones we critics make up and ignore whenever we feel like it. Nowadays, I consider Constantine an incredibly mixed bag that trends toward the positive on the strength of good performances and a lot of understated style. It's hard to call any movie where Keanu Reeves wields a golden drum mag-fed divine shotgun understated, but that's the world we live in now. Wish the side characters got more to do, like Papa Midnight, or John's downstairs neighbor Beeman. But that's a complaint I could lob at any number of Constantine stories, where any number of supporting characters ignominiously die. The fact that most of them die here, leaving me wanting more, despite their minuscule screen time, is a testament to the film's craft. John has a line to Angela after she says she doesn't believe in the devil. Well, you should, because he believes in you. We find out that's true in the end when Satan gives John an extension by curing his cancer in the most painful way possible. Satan believes that, on a long enough timeline, John Constantine, any Constantine, Tyne, whatever, will prove that he belongs in hell. But John's friends all believe the exact opposite, that he can actually be a force for good in the world, even when he doesn't believe in so-called good, or himself. For a big old depressive boy like me, who's convinced we already live in hell, certainly sweating enough for it. That is as close to a state of grace as we're liable to get. And that's as close to a hopeful, uplifting ending as I'm gonna get to all of this. I mean, shit. Arbitrary rating out of 5. See it if you haven't. Check it out again if you have. But if it's been a while, it's better than you might remember. But goddammit, they just had to tack some stupid voiceover onto the end. Assuming that we in the audience were all dummies who needed to have the moral of the story spelled out for us, even though it's the same moral the rest of our society spells out for us every goddamn day. It's the same impulse that added the voiceover to the theatrical cut of Blade Runner. And honestly, who likes that thing? Wait. Guillermo? Is that you? Thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you really liked it, and donate to our Patreon if you really, really liked it. That way you can really achieve a state of grace and take your place among the elect. Like Mr. Hootie Dean, Detective Steve, The After Movie Diner, and Stu G. Next time, back to hell. By which I mean New Jersey.